Hi, this is Gina Dubbé, and I am a dispensary owner in Maryland in the USA. Can you believe I was a 60-year-old cannabis virgin and now own a dispensary? Come and listen to the story on Professionally Cannabis.
Hi, this is Dr. Leslie Apgar, and I am the medical director of Greenhouse Wellness, a medical cannabis dispensary in Maryland. You are listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh.
Hello, listener, and welcome back to the Professionally Cannabis Podcast. Today is a really exciting episode for us. Oscar, do you want to tell our listeners why?
Well, we've tried something a little bit new, really. It's our first time having two guests on at once, and Gina and Leslie, two parts of a dispensary outfit, the doctor and the business person, came together to give us a wonderful understanding of that perspective, which, Jonathan, we haven't had anyone from a dispensary before, have we?
No, we haven't. And I know that both of us were really keen to get this perspective, particularly in these coronavirus times where there are restrictions on people going out the house, social distancing, lockdown. We know that these dispensaries are crucial for patients getting their medicine, and was really thankful for Dr. Leslie and Gina to give us the amazing insight they're able to bring to the table.
So, dear listener, in this special episode, you're getting twice the guests, so twice the value. Enjoy.
Where do they go, the smoke rings
It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the pod Dr. Leslie Apgar and Gina Dubbé, best friends, but much more importantly, the managing and medical directors of Greenhouse Wellness. For the first time on the pod, we'll get an insight into the life of dispensary owners, how they serve patients in need of medical cannabis, and equally as important, the journey that got them to this point. Leslie, Gina, great to have you join us on Professionally Cannabis.
Oh, it's so good to be here. Thank you so much for having us.
Hi, this is Gina. We are so happy to be a part of the podcast.
So we like to start our question with what led you to the plant, and as this is our first time having two guests, perhaps there's two different paths here, so I'd love to hear more.
Well, this is Leslie, and I am a board-certified OBGYN, and I also have a medical spa, and I started that in about 2008, realizing that the practice of medicine in the traditional sense was never going to pay off my medical school debt, so I opened up my medical spa. And I continued to work in both fields, still seeing OBGYN patients and then seeing patients at the medical spa. And one day, one of my patients at the med spa said to me quite innocently, "Hey, Dr. Apgar, we know that you're from the West Coast and you're sort of open-minded, and me and my guys are going to be bidding for a grow processor and dispensary in Maryland. And are you interested in being our medical director, at least on paper, for the bid?" And I said, "Well, that's an interesting idea." And then the conversation changed and it led to, "Hey, we need funding." And I said, "Well, my best friend can get funding and she has funding. So let's have a conversation with Gina." And I said, "Please, though, Gina's the real deal. She's a venture capitalist and she's been in league with the big firms and the big guys out there. Please don't waste her time. And please, if we're going to have a conversation, please let's have a real conversation." And they assured me that that would be the case. So one day after playing tennis, because like all working moms, we're usually trying to cram two things into one time period, we had played tennis on a Wednesday and we were driving back home together because we lived just down the street from each other. And we had a conference call with the team that was putting together this bid. And I'll let Gina tell the story about how that conference call went.
Well, when you try to do diligence on any opportunity, you ask a lot of questions. And one of the questions was, what is the return profile for this particular opportunity? Because in venture, what we look at is what the risk to reward proportion is. And the gentleman said to me, "Oh, honey, you would never understand the math." And I was totally taken aback. I'm like, of course I would understand the math. And he just wouldn't go there with us. And so Leslie and I looked at each other in the car and we knew right then there was no way we were going into business with this character. And Les dropped me off. We're backdoor neighbors, so it wasn't a far trip. And I called her probably about the same time she got in the house and said, "We can do this our damn self." I looked up the RFP. You're looking at two people who have never run a dispensary, know little to nothing about cannabis, but a business is a business is a business. And so we decided we'd bid ourselves. We had 10 days left in the RFP period. We put together a 600-page proposal and we tossed it over the wall.
So Gina's being a little modest because as a physician, I didn't know what an RFP meant, request for proposal. I'd certainly never been a part of one before. And also, as a Western trained physician, it's not typical to function outside of one's specialty. And I had already taken that path to being in the aesthetics industry with the medical spa. So cannabis is not anything that I had been exposed to in medical school, except for to know that it was theoretically a gateway drug and it supposedly decreases sperm count. So I didn't know much about the cannabis space, but I knew that it was certainly an opportunity that was worth pursuing. And Gina had also been approached by others in the investment space as far as looking into cannabis opportunities. So it wasn't as crazy and isolated of an event as it may seem at first glance. But at the end of the day, I had to take a big, deep breath and just jump into a completely unknown territory. So I did a very deep dive into the science of cannabis, whatever I could cobble together, and help Gina as far as the science part of it. But Gina did the lion's share of this. It was really a business proposal, and it was how to set up a business that would thrive and flourish. And happily, my sweet Gina has done a great job in that regard.
Well, my question from that is, how did you get up to speed in order to write a 600-page proposal in 10 days that would cover all the bases for whichever, was it a state department you had to apply to or a local government agency?
It was the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission, so it was a state entity. Well, the first thing I did when we decided to bid on this Wednesday night, because it was due a week Friday, was I downloaded 6 books from Amazon. How to Run a Dispensary, All You Need to Know About Cannabis. And what I realized was this was a business proposal. It was 185 questions about the business of business. How would you train? How would you manage your customers? How would you make sure that you adhered to the state's security and safety regulations? It was more about business than it was about cannabis. And so it allowed us to write with, I think, some accuracy and innovative ways to really attack this market. And we were very fortunate. We put in 5 proposals. You could only win one. And we got our first choice of the 5. So whatever we wrote must have resonated with the evaluators.
So, Jonathan, I will tell you, are not your typical cannabis dispensary owners. And I don't think that our application was anything close to typical as well. Because number one, you had a true businesswoman and venture capitalist in Gina. And then you had a medical doctor who was actually going to give her attention to this, cannabis space that is, we're still trying to get the real science to support. And I think that was very strange to the commission when they were evaluating criteria. We wanted to run this place like a residency program. And the whole point of me being involved is to legitimize this industry and certainly our dispensary, but most importantly, to provide education. And the way a residency program runs is that you have attending physicians at the top who are the resource that you go to when you've failed at all the other levels. We have nurses on staff here. We have then our chief residents, and then our interns and our residents, which are the wellness consultants. And so everybody's trained in our dispensary from a very medical point of view, which is really not the way this industry has ever been run. And so we really were tipping this whole thing on its head out of the gate. Gina and I have learned, if nothing else, that we have to be authentic. And if we think that something makes sense, or if we're attracted to something, then odds are a lot of other people will be attracted to that as well.
If you talk about altering your path from the existing dogmas in the cannabis industry, how does your dispensary, coming at it with a sort of novel approach from new participants, feel different to other dispensaries around?
Well, let me take you a walk through Greenhouse. We wanted it to be different from the beginning. Our goal was to make it more like an Apple store or a med spa. You walk in, everything's filled with natural light, living plants, orchids, white leather furniture, and chandeliers. We wanted something that our mothers would feel comfortable walking into as an exquisite medical interaction. We didn't want the seedy dispensaries that everybody thinks of with dark wood and people on hoodies and skateboards rolling around. We wanted something that was elevating. And interestingly, our patient base, the average age is 60. And we have people coming in every day with legitimate medical concerns that sit down with our wellness consultants and our nurses. We have a non-traditional population, and it's allowed us to have a niche here in Maryland. We have a large hospice and terminally ill segment, and we save all the medications for those people in the vault for the duration of their illness, because it's difficult to get product in Maryland still. There's a scarcity issue. And so we feel that our responsibility to our hospice patients are first and foremost. And then we have a very large population of people with all different ailments that come to us. So you come in here, it's all natural light, it's chandeliers, everyone's happy, there's music playing. It is just a happy place to come and visit.
And from a medical standpoint, it's such a weird situation, because usually what happens is that when you're ill or you're feeling poorly, you see a physician or a practitioner, and they may prescribe a medication for you, which then goes to the pharmacy, and then you pick it up and you take it as directed. But in the cannabis space, what you get is a physician or a provider that will give you a recommendation to come into a dispensary, but absolutely no recommendations as to how to take that medicine. So what a silly situation. Like, how is that going to survive? That's not a good idea, right? Mm-hmm. So we had to figure out how to address that barrier and that inadequacy. And so that's where the training of me first, I had to learn so that then I could train the rest of the staff. That's where that became imperative, because really what you have to do is have a consultation with the patients. It's not just picking up my meds. And the consultation and the time that we spend with our patients and the attention that we give them is what sets us so apart, because the medicine is the medicine. But what we do differently is we connect with them. And I almost think that my wellness consultants are practicing medicine. And it's really fantastic to watch.
For my 2 cents, it's clear that both your authenticity and your expertise were not just the key as to why your RFP was successful, but it's why you've been able to create such an amazing organization that does tap into different segments of society outside of the traditional, quote unquote, stoner culture, people that you would think traditionally be engaged in cannabis. And I think all of this considered, it makes it all the more crazy looking back to the reaction that man had when you had your initial meeting with him, when he'd completely dismissed you guys being able to know the finances and everything around that. One of the things you mentioned in your book, High Heels, is that less than 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Now, I've got a 2-part question here, and for regular listeners of the pod, they'll know that I'm a big fan of sort of 2- and 3-part questions. But why do you think this is the case, and what do you think the cannabis industry can do to ensure that in the medium to long term, the percentage of women holding CEO and other senior leadership positions in businesses doesn't regress and moreover increases from the current levels?
I think that's an interesting question. First of all, you are absolutely correct. Cannabis has, I think, one of the least number of women and minorities in leadership roles. And part of that is money and risk, right? Because it takes a lot of money to start a dispensary, or even more for a grow and processor. And traditionally that money stays in the male part of society in the financial industries. So there's a natural bent for those people to lead. Now, how can cannabis dispensaries or the cannabis industry change that? Part of that is to change the bidding process and have set-asides for women and minorities, because it's a fascinating perspective that what we do is in these RFPs, we evaluate based on the financial capabilities and wherewithal. So if you're a large publicly traded company, you are going to win every single time.
So you're talking about the startup capital requirements for this industry as being perhaps part of the reason why you don't have more of an intersectional leadership team in cannabis. How expensive was it to set up in Maryland? Are costs the same across the country?
It is an interesting perspective on how to set up. For a grow and a processor, you're talking tens of millions. For a dispensary, you're still talking several million. And that is one of the interesting disparities when people do start. You see a large death rate in dispensaries because people are undercapitalized from the beginning. And it takes a large amount of money to stock an inventory and to be security and compliance related. And so you have got to go into this knowing that you have a 9 to 12 month cash flow run rate. And most dispensaries open up without that. In addition, in the United States, we're regulated by what's called 280E taxation, which means we can't write anything off that a traditional business writes off. Most businesses can write off labor. They can write off cost of goods sold. They can write off marketing. All we can write off is cost of goods. So our effective tax rate is about 70%. And what happens is after the first year, a dispensary realizes, oh my God, I didn't charge enough to cover my taxes. And that's when you start seeing a death rate.
That and the license is what, $40,000 a year?
You're in Maryland, correct?
Yeah, just for a dispensary. I mean, the license fees for processors and growers are much, much higher, but I don't think that the public understands the financial constraints in the industry.
And I guess it's not just the financial constraints, but also the difficulties it can be in terms of financial operations. You know, when you guys first got started, how did you go about sorting out bank accounts and other financial facilities for yourself?
Well, that is a fascinating question. When we first were awarded, we bid under my name. And so I registered the business under my name, Gina Dubbé, because we didn't have time to form an LLC. So the bank saw that I had won a dispensary and called me up and said, "We'd like to invite you to leave the bank." And I was horrified. This was a bank that my children's savings accounts were in, our mortgage was in. And I said to them, "There are other men who have won dispensaries. When you cut them off, you can cut me off." And I hung up. Now, they never did, but there's one bank in all of Maryland that services the cannabis industry. We get no interest. We can't write checks. We can't wire. We can't do anything.
And it's pretty expensive, right?
Oh, it's very expensive, and we don't get interest on our money. So we are just appalled by the lack of banking, and that is because cannabis is a Schedule I drug. And because it's Schedule I, it's federally illegal, and because it's federally illegal, the banks can't work with us. What we need to change the whole perspective here is for cannabis to become a different schedule of drug.
So that was one part of it, but even finding space to put our dispensary was a huge problem. We went all over the place looking for space that we thought would be adequate and safe and kind of to give the feel that we wanted. And nobody would return our phone calls. And if we did get an interview with the board, you know, they knew the answer before we even walked in the door, which was we're not going to rent to these drug mavens. So it was really very interesting to feel like such a pariah of society and to have such a difficult time in finding space for the same reasons with the banking rules. So we did finally find a space. It was, again, due to a offhand comment of one of my patients who said, "Hey, you know, you should look up Dr. Ross. He owns that building, that medical building, and he might have space available. And he's open-minded and integrative physician, and you should give him a call." So I cold called him out of the blue and said, "Hey, we have some of the same patients, and this is what my best friend and I are doing. Isn't that crazy? I must have lost my mind, but here's what we're doing. Do you have any space available?" And he said, "You know what? I think I might have an idea. Why don't you ladies come on by?" So by having an idea, he meant that he was willing to relocate his own medical spa on the ground floor upstairs so that we could have a ground floor location. And that was because of the requirements to have this ridiculous vault and all of the security related to said vault. And it was so heavy, it needed to be on the ground floor. So that's what he did for us. And we couldn't be more grateful and we couldn't be happier with our location because we're in like I said, a medical building, an integrative healthcare center upstairs with an apothecary. There's a pharmacy next door. There's physical therapy. There's all kinds of medicine, even a big, huge radiology company right across the building from us. So we are very happy for the collaborative spirit that exists here. And we're lucky because so many other people, even to this day, are struggling to find acceptable space.
And I imagine actually, you know, albeit the tough journey it was to find your location, actually being located in this medical spot here perhaps gives the dispensary even more efficacy to non-traditional cannabis users who are potentially looking into cannabis medicines because it's associated with this large health and wellness center.
So Jonathan, is very interesting because really what Gina and I have seen over the last 2.5 years is a shift in the attitude and in the stigma surrounding cannabis. Whereas before, the physicians that I worked with were telling me, "Leslie, you've lost your mind. You're throwing away your career. Like, doing a medical spa is bad enough, but why are you going into the cannabis industry? This is insane." So now those same physicians are either coming to us themselves as a patient or they're sending us their loved ones. And I think that part of the reason that there's a softening in the stigma surrounding cannabis is education, surely. But mostly, I think it's because people are witnessing the benefits of cannabis, either directly or indirectly. It's hard to argue with some of the miraculous improvement in the patient's quality of life that we see. And so once the public starts witnessing that themselves, the stigma is shifting. So I really think it's a different environment today than it was 2.5 years ago. And I don't think that we would necessarily run into the same negativity if we were to start this process today.
I totally concur.
And in line with that, talking about the changes going on in cannabis, I'm quite curious to know what's changing for your patients in terms of the products you're recommending, or even perhaps the products available to them. Because while there's been this huge shift towards cannabis, there's probably been a fairly big shift in the product mix. Right.
So the whole program has matured. First of all, when we started, there was not very much
available.
There
were 5 products.
What do we have now, Gina?
300.
Yeah, so it's been a fairly steep curve there as to what is available. Gina and I have also really changed our attitude about the dry flower, the plant material versus concentrates. We really thought that the plant was sort of dirty and tawdry and unsophisticated, and we really didn't want our patients smoking, and we wanted them to use what we would consider more sophisticated concentrates. And our opinions have changed. It was like many things we were wrong about, but if nothing else, are very open-minded. So in any case, the patients early on did not have many choices on how to medicate. But happily today, there are lots of choices, and we sell a lot of tinctures. Tinctures are ancient medicine, and I like them because I can titrate the dose versus if I give somebody a pill or a capsule, the dose is the dose is the dose, and you can't really change it so much. So I love tinctures to start out, especially cannabis naive patients. We also have a ton of, we don't really have edibles because we're not allowed to have food yet in Maryland. They're still trying to work out the food safety component to it, which I very much appreciate. But we do have things that we would consider gummies or chewable tablets or...
So how does that work?
So really what we are trying to do in the state of Maryland is make sure that the food that we ingest is as safe as the medicine that we ingest. While I don't want to get E. coli from my cannabis flower, I certainly don't want to get E. coli from the chocolate bar that's infused with the cannabis flower. Does that make sense?
Yes, but presumably chocolatiers don't have to go through strict regulations either. I mean, you wouldn't want to be selling chocolate with the E. coli, but you're also not testing chocolate bars, are we?
Well, we do have a whole food safety situation here in the United States where our food sources have to go through rigorous testing. And that's where the holdup is as far as converting a cannabis product to what would be considered a food product. So that's a whole governmental thing that is beyond Gina and my pay grade, but is what is holding up the official edible component to our menus. We have lots of things that you would come in here and know is an edible, but it's packaged in a pill bottle and it's very sterile looking. It's not, a cute candy bar or whatever, but we're getting around it. The problem I do have with edibles is that oftentimes they taste really good. And when something tastes really good, you probably want to have more than one. And so people have had problems with overdoses and things in the past. I'm not in a huge hurry for edibles, but I know that the patients would love them.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean about the taste aspect of it, encouraging perhaps what could be considered over-medication. And how are gummies not considered foods, thus that you can sell them under current regulation?
Boy, we ask that ourselves every day. They give them lovely names like troches or troches or lozenges, but for some reason, gummies have slipped through the Maryland regulatory system.
Don't ask, don't tell.
And with regards to the client and patient base that come to your dispensary, is it 100% medical, or are you able to offer product to those in the area that are keen to dabble on a more recreational slant?
What people choose to do with what they buy is certainly up to them. Maryland has only a medical situation right now, so you have to qualify as a medical patient with one of like 6 or 10 conditions.
So that said, Jonathan, we understand, and we certainly understood when we started this, that this medical market and this medical program was a recreational one masquerading as a medical one. And Gina and I wanted to really focus on the medicine to legitimize this whole industry and elevate the whole industry. And that's still our passion and our focus every single day. So within that, we realized obviously that we were going to have the recreational patients coming in, and we obviously needed to have products that would speak to anybody that comes into our dispensary. And interestingly, what we found very early on is that these recreational patients were probably treating something. And oftentimes it became apparent to us very quickly that they were treating anxiety or pain.
Or PTSD.
PTSD.
I tell you, the one fellow that walked in and talked to you was heartbreaking.
Yeah, he was demanding the highest THC product that we have. And it's been so frustrating as the disseminator of the scientific knowledge to try and educate people about what THC is and what THC is not. And It's so sad. As somebody who enjoys fine wine, it's like going into a wine store and asking where the Everclear is located. It's just missing all the good stuff. And so it's been frustrating. So when you're in your medical training, you're taught to ask the question 3 times to a patient, give them 3 opportunities to tell you what's really going on. And I had asked him a couple of times, hey, it would help if I understood what we were treating. I could help direct you to the products I think that would help the most. Just give me what has the highest THC. He was just irritated. You could just tell. So I did, in a different way, ask the question a 3rd time, and he threw up his hands and he said, fine. Okay, I was in Iraq, all right? So I knew immediately that he had PTSD, and it was such a visible change in his demeanor. His whole face changed. He had tears in his eyes, and we were able to have a conversation about a totally different line of products with different terpenes and different cannabinoid ratios. And I was able to educate him in a way that he would never have gotten if I had just given him the flower with the highest THC. It was a good lesson to not to judge a book by its cover and to try and ask questions that might be able to help you understand what a recreational user is actually treating.
It's funny. People want to tell their story. And if you go on our website, we have 4 unscripted testimonials for cervical dystonia, for MS, for MD, for chronic pain, for opioid addiction. So people are curing themselves, and they're so proud of what they've done. And we cry with those who don't make it, and we cheer with those who do.
I think our Superman story is pretty important to tell. As a physician, you get fairly used to making diagnoses when patients walk in. And this one individual didn't walk in, he rolled in. He was in a wheelchair, listing to the side, a completely defeated look on his face. And he had Superman pajamas. And his wife, his lovely wife, was with him. And when I heard his diagnosis that it was metastatic renal cell carcinoma that had gone to his spine, and he had lesions in his spine, I was like, well, I know how this book is going to end, and this is not going to end well. And with the help of cannabis and his amazing wife, who went to such lengths to take care of her amazing husband, he started to regain function. He started to get his appetite back. He got his catheter removed. He was
able to drive?
Able to drive. He was taking less pain medication. He was able to draft, was it letters?
He translated letters to his wife to write for his children on all their important days, because we knew that eventually the cancer was going to win. But he got over a year of good, pain-free time to spend with his children in a quality manner. Mm-hmm. He still passed, sadly.
He had quality of life that, as a physician, in a patient that has this kind of cancer and this kind of prognosis, I had never seen this before. I mean, this was jaw-dropping. So that was early on with the dispensary. And since then, I couldn't even count. And I couldn't even tell you how many stories exactly like that we have seen, that cannabis has completely changed lives.
Well, no doubt that you guys play an incredibly significant role in the lives of many patients in the area. And I guess something that's very topical that I'd love to touch upon is that the elephant in the room at the moment is, of course, coronavirus, COVID-19. Now, with this considered and the various degrees of lockdown measures and social distancing measures that governments around the world have been putting in place, what impact is that having on the dispensary? What impact is that having on patients' access to medicines? And how have you guys gone about addressing, the clear issues surrounding COVID-19?
We are considered an essential business here in Maryland, so we are allowed to continue operations with some restrictions. We've got to have personal protective equipment for all of our staff. We need to protect our patients with social distancing. So when we can migrate back into the dispensary, we've put up cough guards and some separation gear for our patients. But at the moment, we are operating curbside. So you come in, you place your order online, and when you pull up and put your blinkers on, we go out and we do everything outside from your car. So no one comes in, no one touches anything. We do all the business outside the dispensary, and we'll continue that until the U.S. government or our governor tells us that that's not the way to do it. But interestingly enough, the desire for cannabis has not decreased, but rather increased, at least in the medical markets, because we do see anxiety and sleep as our top conditions. And I think people are struggling with both of those right now.
Yeah, the anxiety, I know I just read an article about the prescriptions for anti-anxiety medicines have gone up 34%. And then Gina and I can tell you for sure, the cannabis that's being consumed for anxiety has gone up at least 34%. But yeah, this has been a very interesting time because you would think that we wouldn't be getting all these new patients because it's a little bit harder to get certified and all of that with COVID. But our new patients are through the roof. And you can imagine that the condition that they are looking for help, to treat is anxiety.
So fundamentally, from your perspective, there's actually been, say, an increase in business due to COVID. But at the same time, I'd say with your patient profile of being older folk and people near the end of life, it seems like that wouldn't be the case unless COVID hasn't really hit its peak yet in Maryland. So I guess from a timings point of view, is it under wraps where you are for now?
Not at all. We're expecting the peak in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And so we kept expecting our census to go down, and it certainly has not met those expectations.
So what we found as far as COVID is we found patients reacting as if we were going to have a blizzard, and they wanted to stock up on their essentials. They wanted to get their toilet paper and their bread and their eggs and their cannabis.
It's a global issue.
Right. So that's what we were witnessing. And then Gina and I said, well, okay, so everybody's got their stock and it should calm down. But
it hasn't.
It hasn't calmed down.
And are you going to do any special measures for people who are in self-isolation at home or quarantine? Do you have a delivery service currently?
We typically don't deliver. However, for our hospice patients, we do. We find that most folks can drive to the dispensary, simply pick up their medication. It takes under 5 minutes to do and head on home. Delivery is tough. Delivery is tough for people. There's a schedule issue, and it's tough for our staff, and we want equal protection for both.
On a sort of regulatory standpoint, if you guys were to sort of move more towards delivery, what safeguards would you have to put in place?
So we had put in significant security and surveillance measures at the dispensary. So to move away from that so completely and have some individual driving around in a vehicle, it just seemed very incongruous to us. So it's not necessarily a model that we're eagerly anticipating being involved in. That said, if the schedule changes and the regulations change, I think it might be a great thing for the patients.
On that point, as we reach towards the end of our time together, where would you like to see the regulations on dispensaries going in Maryland or perhaps in the US on a wider level?
Well, Leslie and I are in violent and complete agreement that cannabis needs to come off of Schedule 1. Mm-hmm. Because by coming off of Schedule 1, it does a couple of things. First of all, we can do federal research, which is not available right now. So we're talking about all anecdotal responses to different terpenes, to different THC levels. So federal research is number one and coming off of Schedule 1. The second thing that that'll do for us is allow banking. And banking really is a challenge. It's a challenge for all the cannabis dispensaries. And finally, coming off of Schedule 1 will change the 280E taxation rules, which will make cannabis a more viable business for the long term. So we think without question that's the first and foremost thing that needs to happen in the industry.
And then I would love for all the medical to teach about endocannabinoid system and cannabis medicine. And I would love for that to be legitimized so that we could go back to a more sensible structure within the cannabis industry. Because right now, Gina and I are very much an outlier. If I go to another dispensary, I'm not going to have a medical director there, and I'm not going to have wellness consultants or bud tenders that are as well trained as ours are. They'll certainly know what they have on their shelves, but they won't be able to have a conversation about the endocannabinoid system.
And terpenes.
So if we could get that kind of education from the roots up, we'll all be better off. And I cannot wait, like Gina said, for some excellent articles and some research to come out.
Do you see the dispensary model as something that could and should be replicated in and across other countries?
I think that that's the way to do it. One of the issues that we have here in the U.S. is this is becoming more and more owned by big managed operators, and they own the grow and the process and the dispensaries. And so it's almost like the pharmaceutical companies owning all the pharmacies. And that's why women and minority aren't a part of the industry. We really need to go to a little more distributed model and not this centralized one company owns all.
Perfect. I think that's a lovely note to wrap it up on. Gina and Leslie, thank you very much for joining us on Professionally Cannabis.
It has been our pleasure. Thank you for adding some insight into the industry.
Yeah, we really appreciate the continued efforts at education. So thanks. It was our pleasure to do this with you.
Where do they go? The smoke rings I I blow each
Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you enjoyed having two guests, actually, let us know. Otherwise, all other forms of engagement are greatly appreciated. Likes, comments, and subscriptions all help propel the podcast onwards to others. So, if you enjoyed it, please do that. And we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
love. Please take me above. Take me with you.